In the early decades of the 19th century, a strange confidence was settling over Europe. The smoke of new factories rose above cities that were growing faster than they ever had before, and engineers were laying iron rails across landscapes that had known only horse and cart for centuries. Thinkers spoke of progress as though it were a law of nature, something as certain as gravity, pulling humanity steadily upward toward greater comfort, greater knowledge, greater freedom. It was an age that believed in itself. The revolutions of the previous generation had shaken old monarchies and planted the idea that society could be rebuilt along rational lines. Science was unlocking the mechanics of the natural world at a pace that made earlier centuries look almost motionless by comparison. And philosophy, at least in the German-speaking world, had taken on a grand, systematic ambition, an effort to explain reality itself as a vast unfolding of reason, moving towards some ultimate purpose. Yet, not everyone was swept up in the mood. In the prosperous city of Frankfurt, in a comfortable set of rented rooms overlooking the river, a man sat writing pages that flatly denied nearly every article of this faith. He argued that the universe was not guided by reason, that human life was not improving in any meaningful sense, and that the deepest truth about existence was something most people spent their entire lives trying not to face. His name was Arthur Schopenhauer, and he would become one of the most unsettling voices in the history of Western thought. What makes Schopenhauer so difficult to categorize is the gap between what he preached and how he lived. His philosophy was, at its core, a philosophy of suffering. He insisted that desire was a trap, that the world was driven by a blind, purposeless force, and that the wisest response to life was a kind of radical renunciation, a turning away from the wants and appetites that kept human beings running on a wheel of frustration. Asceticism, the deliberate denial of bodily pleasure, stood near the summit of his moral vision. And yet, Schopenhauer himself was anything but an ascetic. He had inherited a considerable fortune from his father, a wealthy merchant who had died when Schopenhauer was still a teenager, and this inheritance freed him from any need to earn a living. He never held a permanent academic post, never depended on a patron, and never experienced the grinding poverty that shaped so many writers of his era. His daily routine in Frankfurt reflected this comfort in ways that would have embarrassed a saint. He rose late, worked through the morning on his manuscripts, and then walked to one of the city's better dining clubs, where he ate a full midday meal, often the most expensive item available. He kept a poodle, a succession of them in fact, as his primary companions, and in the evenings he played the flute, an instrument he had studied seriously and practiced with genuine devotion. He was not reclusive in any conventional sense either. He attended the theatre, read several newspapers daily, and could be found most afternoons at his regular table in a hotel dining room, holding forth on whatever subject caught his attention. Visitors who expected to find a gaunt, tormented hermit were often startled to meet a compact, well-dressed man with sharp eyes and a sharp tongue, clearly enjoying a good bottle of wine. This is the paradox that any honest account of Schopenhauer must sit with rather than explain away. He was a man who wrote with extraordinary power about the futility of desire while arranging his own life to satisfy a great many desires quite comfortably. He argued that the individual will should be quieted, even extinguished, while fiercely protecting his own independence, his own routines, his own pleasures. Whether this makes him a hypocrite or simply a thinker honest enough to admit that he could not fully live up to his own insights is a question worth holding open. What is certain is that the comfortable rooms in Frankfurt, the flute music drifting through the evening air, the well-fed poodle sleeping by the desk, none of this diminished the force of what he wrote. The pages he produced in that golden cage would go on to unsettle an entire century's assumptions about reason, progress, and the nature of the human mind. The book that Schopenhauer believed would change philosophy arrived in the world almost without a sound. He had published his major work while still in his early 30s, a dense and ambitious volume that attempted nothing less than a complete account of reality and the human place within it. He was certain it would be recognized immediately as a masterpiece, a correction to what he saw as the wrong direction German philosophy had taken. Instead, the first printings sold so poorly that most of the copies eventually ended up as waste paper. This failure stung, but it did not break his confidence. Schopenhauer had an unusual relationship with his own talent. He regarded it not as a hope or an aspiration, but as a settled fact, something the world had simply not yet caught up with. He compared himself to great minds of the past who had been ignored in their own time, and he treated public indifference not as evidence that his work might be flawed, but as proof that the public was not yet ready. It was a posture that made patience easier, but bitterness almost inevitable. What made the silence especially galling was the noise being made at that very moment by a philosopher Schopenhauer despised. In the lecture halls of the University of Berlin, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was drawing enormous crowds and reshaping the intellectual landscape of Germany. Hegel's system was everything Schopenhauer's was not: optimistic in its architecture, dense in its abstractions, and deeply reassuring to a culture that wanted to believe history was moving somewhere meaningful. Hegel argued that reality unfolded through a grand logical process, a kind of cosmic reasoning that worked through contradictions and resolved them at ever higher levels of understanding. History, in his view, was not a chaotic sequence of accidents, but the progressive self-realization of what he called spirit, a term that carried overtones of reason, freedom, and collective consciousness all at once. Suffering and upheaval were not pointless. They were necessary stages in a journey toward greater rationality. For Schopenhauer, this was not philosophy at all, but intellectual fraud dressed in difficult language. He accused Hegel of using deliberately obscure prose to disguise the emptiness of his ideas, stringing together abstractions that sounded profound but dissolved into nonsense under close examination. The contempt was genuine and deeply personal. Schopenhauer called him a charlatan, a windbag, and worse, insults he would repeat with variations for the rest of his life. But insults alone were not enough. Schopenhauer wanted to defeat Hegel, not just in private letters and manuscript margins, but in the arena where Hegel's dominance was most visible: the lecture hall. So, having secured the right to teach as an unsalaried lecturer at the University of Berlin, he made a decision that was either extraordinarily bold or extraordinarily foolish. He scheduled his own lectures at the exact same hour that Hegel gave his. The logic seemed to rest on a conviction that sheer intellectual quality would be enough to pull students away from the reigning master. Schopenhauer apparently believed that once young minds had the chance to hear clear, honest philosophy spoken plainly, they would abandon Hegel's packed auditorium and cross the hall to his. It was a gamble that required the world to work the way Schopenhauer thought it should, rewarding genuine insight over institutional prestige rather than the way it actually did. The result was devastating. Hegel's lecture hall remained full to overflowing, students crowding the benches and standing along the walls, while Schopenhauer faced rows of empty seats. A handful of listeners appeared at first, perhaps drawn by curiosity, but even these dwindled as the term wore on. By some accounts, there were sessions where no one came at all, leaving Schopenhauer standing alone at the lectern in a room designed for dozens. It is difficult to overstate what this must have felt like for a man of his temperament. Schopenhauer did not merely want to be heard. He believed, with a certainty that bordered on the religious, that he had discovered fundamental truths about the nature of existence. To be ignored was bad enough. To be ignored in direct, measurable comparison with a thinker he considered a fraud was a humiliation that cut to the core of his identity. He tried again the following term, but the outcome never changed. The students did not come. Hegel continued to dominate Berlin, attracting disciples who would carry his ideas into law, theology, political theory, and every other corner of German intellectual life. Schopenhauer was not merely losing an argument, he was being made invisible in the one setting where he had staked his claim to recognition. Eventually, he stopped trying. He left Berlin and settled permanently in Frankfurt, where his inheritance funded the comfortable life he had always known. But the retreat carried a cost beyond wounded pride. It severed him from the institutional world of German universities at a time when those universities were the primary engine for spreading philosophical ideas. Without students, without disciples, without a faculty position to lend his name weight in academic circles, his work remained stranded on the margins. What followed were decades of near-total obscurity. He continued to write, refining his arguments, sharpening his attacks on Hegel, producing essays on everything from ethics to aesthetics to the art of winning an argument. The quality of the prose was often remarkable, cleaner, and more vivid than almost anything else being written in German philosophy at the time. The bitterness settled in, like a slow weather change. His letters and notebooks from these years are laced with contempt not just for Hegel, but for the entire academic establishment, which he described as a conspiracy of mediocrity, a system designed to promote obedient minds and punish original ones. There was self-pity in this, and no small amount of vanity, but also something sharper, a genuine anger at what he saw as the corruption of philosophy into a profession, a career path, a means of earning a salary rather than a search for truth. Beneath the anger, visible only in glimpses, was something that looked very much like loneliness. Schopenhauer had chosen isolation, or at least had chosen the path that led to it. But choosing a thing does not make it painless. He lived alone with his poodle and his flute and his manuscripts, waiting for a recognition that would not arrive for another 30 years, sustained by an unshakable belief that he was right, and that the world would eventually catch up. Whether that belief was arrogance or courage, or simply the only alternative to despair, is not an easy question to answer. The book that the world had ignored carried a title that announced its ambitions plainly: The World as Will and Representation. It was not a modest contribution to some narrow academic debate, nor a refinement of ideas already in circulation. Schopenhauer intended it as a single, unified account of everything: the nature of reality, the structure of human experience, the roots of suffering, and the possibility of something like redemption. That it failed to find readers for so long says less about the work itself than about the intellectual climate into which it landed, a climate saturated with Hegelian optimism and deeply unreceptive to what Schopenhauer was actually proposing. The architecture of the book rested on a distinction that sounds simple enough at first, but quickly opens into something far more unsettling. Schopenhauer divided reality into two aspects. On one side was the world as we perceive it, the world of objects, colors, shapes, causes and effects, the whole orderly theater of experience that we navigate every day. This he called representation, borrowing and extending an insight from Kant, who had argued a generation earlier that we never experience reality as it is in itself, but only as it is filtered through the structures of our own minds. Kant had drawn a sharp line between the world as it appears to us and the world as it actually is, what he called the thing in itself. He insisted that this deeper reality was unknowable, permanently hidden behind the veil of human perception. Most philosophers who followed Kant accepted this limit or tried to work around it through increasingly elaborate systems of logic. Schopenhauer took a radically different approach. He claimed that there was one crack in the wall, one place where a person could slip behind the veil of appearance and touch the thing in itself directly, and that place was the human body. The reasoning was deceptively straightforward. When you raise your arm, you do not merely observe the movement from the outside, the way you might watch a branch sway in the wind. You also experience it as an act of willing, an impulse that is felt rather than seen. This inner experience, Schopenhauer argued, was not just a quirk of psychology, but a genuine glimpse of what reality is when it is not being filtered through the lens of perception. What we feel when we act, that surging, striving, wanting, is the same force that drives everything in the universe, only experienced directly rather than observed at a distance. He gave this force a name that has caused confusion ever since. He called it the will, but he did not mean anything like ordinary willpower. The conscious decision to choose one thing over another. His will was a blind, ceaseless drive, an energy that pushed and churned and demanded without ever knowing what it wanted or why. It had no intelligence, no purpose, and no end point. It simply was, endlessly expressing itself through every form in the natural world. This was the core of his metaphysics, and it stood in absolute opposition to the dominant philosophical currents of his time. Where Hegel saw the universe as the gradual unfolding of reason, Schopenhauer saw it as the expression of something fundamentally unreasonable. Where Hegel's system culminated in freedom and self-knowledge, Schopenhauer's culminated in a brute force that knew nothing and aimed at nothing. The universe, in his account, was not a rational project slowly reaching completion. It was an aimless convulsion, and everything within it was simply the will manifesting itself in yet another temporary form. The implications were staggering, and Schopenhauer pursued them without flinching. If the will is the fundamental reality behind all appearances, then the individual self is not the autonomous, rational agent that Western philosophy had long assumed it to be. What we experience as our personal desires, our ambitions, our hungers, these are not truly ours in any deep sense. They are the will operating through us, using our bodies and minds the way a current uses a riverbed. This meant that the suffering built into human life was not an accident, not a problem that better governments or better technology could fix. Suffering was structural. It was woven into the fabric of existence because existence itself was driven by a force that could never be satisfied. The will does not want any particular thing. It simply wants. And the creatures it animates are condemned to feel that wanting as an endless succession of needs, cravings, and frustrations. What made Schopenhauer's account so striking to later readers was not just its bleakness, but its coherence. He was not simply complaining about the state of things or expressing a personal mood. He had constructed a systematic metaphysical framework in which suffering followed logically from the nature of reality itself. The argument moved from epistemology through metaphysics to ethics and aesthetics, all held together by this single unifying concept of a blind and purposeless will. The most remarkable feature of this philosophy was where Schopenhauer found its closest echoes, not in the European tradition he had been trained in, but in texts from the other side of the world. While still a young man, he had encountered translations of ancient Indian scriptures, particularly the Upanishads and the foundational teachings of Buddhism. These encounters were not casual. They struck him with the force of recognition, as though he had arrived at the same conclusions by a different road. The Upanishads taught that the visible world of separate objects and distinct selves was Maya, a kind of cosmic illusion concealing a deeper, undivided reality called Brahman. This resonated powerfully with Schopenhauer's claim that the world of representation was essentially a surface phenomenon, a way of organizing experience that masked the singular, undifferentiated will beneath. The parallel was not exact, and Schopenhauer was aware of the differences, but the structural similarity was close enough to astonish him. Buddhism offered an equally striking resonance. The first of Buddhism's foundational insights, often translated as life is suffering, aligned almost perfectly with Schopenhauer's account of existence as inherently painful. The Buddhist diagnosis located suffering's cause in craving and attachment, which mirrored his argument that the will's endless wanting was the engine of all misery. The Buddhist prescription, a path of detachment and the eventual quieting of desire, pointed in a direction Schopenhauer himself would take when he turned to the question of how human beings might escape the cycle. No major European philosopher before him had taken Eastern thought this seriously or woven it this deeply into a Western metaphysical system. The prevailing attitude among his contemporaries ranged from polite curiosity to outright dismissal. Hegel himself had treated Eastern thought as an early and inferior stage in the development of human reason, something the West had long since surpassed. Schopenhauer reversed this judgment entirely. He kept a Latin translation of the Upanishads on his nightstand and called it the greatest consolation of his life. This was not simply an intellectual preference. It carried a genuine philosophical challenge to assumptions so deep in Western thinking that most thinkers had never thought to question them. The idea that reality was fundamentally rational, that the universe was progressing toward something, that individual consciousness was the highest expression of being. By insisting that an ancient Indian text had grasped something his contemporaries had missed, Schopenhauer was suggesting that the entire trajectory of Western metaphysics had taken a wrong turn, and that the corrective had been sitting in Sanskrit manuscripts all along. The synthesis he achieved was imperfect in places, and later scholars would argue about how well he actually understood the texts he admired. But the gesture itself, the willingness to treat non-Western philosophy as a genuine source of insight rather than a curiosity to be catalogued, opened a door that would not close. It planted the idea that the deepest questions about existence might have been asked, and in some cases better answered, far from the lecture halls of Berlin and the libraries of Paris. And it gave his own system a strange, double-rooted authority, as though the blind will, he described, had been sensed independently by thinkers separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, all arriving at the same dark conclusion by very different paths. If reality is a blind, striving will, then the everyday lives of the creatures it animates can only be a series of restless wantings, briefly interrupted by exhaustion. Schopenhauer drew this conclusion with a coldness that startled his readers, and he applied it not just to the obvious miseries of war and illness, but to the ordinary texture of a comfortable middle-class day. The cheerful assumption that human beings were slowly working their way toward greater happiness struck him as a kind of optical illusion, sustained by the short memory of those who held it. His starting point was the nature of desire itself. To want something, he argued, is already to be in a state of lack, a kind of low-grade pain that pushes the wanting creature toward an object that promises relief. Hunger, ambition, lust, curiosity, the longing for status or affection, all of these begin as forms of inner discomfort, and we feel their pressure long before we reach whatever might quiet them. The trouble is that satisfaction, when it finally arrives, does not behave the way we expect. The meal is eaten, the promotion is granted, the beloved person is won, and within a remarkably short time, the glow fades and the mind begins to cast about for the next thing. What we took to be the cause of our happiness turns out to have been only the temporary removal of a specific pain, and once that pain is gone, the silence it leaves behind is not contentment, but a strange unease. Schopenhauer gave this unease a precise name, central to his picture of human life. He called it boredom, though he meant something heavier and more disturbing than the mild restlessness the English word usually suggests. He meant the dawning awareness that nothing in particular is pressing on us, that the engine of wanting has briefly fallen quiet, and that this quiet, far from being pleasant, is itself a form of suffering. From these two observations, he built his famous image of human existence as a pendulum. The mind swings constantly between unfulfilled desire on one side and boredom on the other, never coming to rest at any stable point between them. When we want something we cannot have, we ache for it. And when we get it and no new want has yet appeared, we are oppressed by the emptiness of having nothing to chase. The psychological precision of this model was part of what made it so difficult to dismiss. Schopenhauer was not offering vague spiritual pronouncements about the vanity of earthly pleasures. Those had been made for centuries by preachers and moralists alike. He was describing a mechanism, a structure built into the very way conscious beings relate to their own desires. The pendulum did not swing because people made poor choices or lacked discipline. It swung because wanting is what conscious life is at bottom, and no arrangement of external circumstances can alter that. He pointed to evidence that most people already knew from experience, but had never organized into a coherent picture. A holiday imagined for months delivers a few hours of genuine delight before it becomes routine. A fortune amassed over decades produces a brief thrill of security before the wealthy man begins to worry about losing what he has gained. Even love, perhaps especially love, follows the pattern. The intense longing that precedes union gives way, sooner or later, to familiarity. And familiarity carries its own quiet disappointment. What made this especially devastating was the way it closed off the usual escape routes. The standard response to suffering had always been some version of strive harder, strive smarter, strive toward the right things. Religions promised fulfillment in the next life. Enlightenment thinkers promised it through reason and social progress, and the rising industrial culture of Schopenhauer's era promised it through material abundance. But if the pendulum model was correct, then none of these could work, because the problem was not that people were striving toward the wrong objects. The problem was that striving itself was the source of the pain. This is the point where many readers, both in his time and since, have assumed that his philosophy must collapse into something truly corrosive, a nihilism that declares all values meaningless and all action pointless. If life is nothing but an oscillation between pain and boredom, why bother with morality at all? The assumption seems logical enough, and it has attached itself to Schopenhauer's reputation so firmly that many people who have never read a word of his work still associate his name with bleak indifference to human welfare. But this reading misses something essential about where his argument actually led. Schopenhauer did not conclude that because life is suffering, other people's suffering does not matter. He concluded the opposite. It was precisely because every living creature is caught in the same trap that the suffering of others should command our deepest moral attention. The recognition that another being's pain is, at its root, identical to your own was for Schopenhauer not a reason for despair, but the very foundation of ethics. He built his moral philosophy on a single psychological experience that he believed was more fundamental than any abstract principle or divine commandment. That experience was compassion, not as a polite social emotion, not as something cultivated through religious instruction, but as a direct, almost visceral perception that the boundary between yourself and another suffering creature is thinner than you normally suppose. When you wince at the sight of someone in pain, something in you is briefly piercing the illusion of separateness that the world of representation keeps in place. This was the link back to his metaphysics. If the will is a single undivided force expressing itself through every individual being, then the apparent separation between one person and another is, in a deep sense, an illusion. Compassion, Schopenhauer argued, is the moment when that illusion cracks, when you feel another's suffering as though it were your own, because at the level of the will, it is your own. He drew a sharp contrast between this and the moral systems that dominated European thought. The tradition stretching back through Kant and Christian theology grounded morality in duty, in rational obligation, in commandments handed down from above. Schopenhauer found all of this unconvincing, not because the conclusions were wrong, but because the motivation was hollow. A person who refrains from cruelty only because a rule tells them to has not truly understood why cruelty is wrong. They are obeying a prohibition, not feeling the reality it is meant to protect. Genuine morality, in his account, arises not from obedience, but from a kind of seeing, a direct apprehension of the shared condition of all creatures caught in the will's grip. The person who acts compassionately does so not because they have consulted a moral principle and found it logically binding, but because the suffering in front of them has become, for a moment, indistinguishable from their own. This is why Schopenhauer extended his ethical concern beyond the human species, in a way that was unusual for a European philosopher of his era. Animals, too, are expressions of the will, and to exclude them from moral consideration simply because they lack reason struck him as a failure not of logic, but of perception. There was a deep tension in all of this, and Schopenhauer was honest enough not to resolve it cleanly. His philosophy insisted that all striving was futile, that the will could never be satisfied, and that the pendulum would never stop swinging. Yet, he was simultaneously arguing that compassion, itself a form of engagement with the suffering world, was the highest moral achievement a human being could reach. The answer, to the extent that he gave one, lay in the distinction between living for the will and seeing through it. Most of human life is spent serving the will blindly, chasing desires, fleeing pains, constructing elaborate justifications for appetites that were never chosen in the first place. But in rare moments of compassion, or aesthetic contemplation, or ascetic renunciation, the grip of the will loosens slightly, and the individual stops striving long enough to perceive the world with a clarity that ordinary self-interest always obscures. This was Schopenhauer's answer to the charge of nihilism, and it was more subtle than either his critics or his admirers often acknowledged. He was not saying that nothing matters. He was saying that almost everything people think matters, status, wealth, conquest, legacy, is a puppet show staged by a force that cares nothing for their happiness. What genuinely matters, the one thing that reaches beneath the veil of illusion, is the capacity to feel another creature's pain as one's own. In a philosophy built on darkness, the single, stubborn point of light. Given the unrelenting bleakness of this picture, a world driven by blind wanting, a self that is little more than a vessel for forces it did not choose, the question of escape became unavoidable. If the pendulum of pain and boredom could never be stopped by ordinary means, if no amount of wealth or status or romantic fulfillment could do more than briefly quiet the engine of desire, then was there any experience at all in which a human being could find genuine relief? Schopenhauer believed there was, and he located it in a place that most philosophers before him had treated as a pleasant but ultimately minor department of human life: the experience of beauty. What happens when a person stands before a painting that truly arrests them, or watches light fall across a landscape in a way that momentarily silences every inner demand? Schopenhauer's answer was precise and radical. In that moment, he argued, the individual ceases to be a willing, wanting creature and becomes instead a pure subject of knowing, a consciousness that perceives without desiring, that sees without reaching for what it sees. The restless self, always calculating what it can get or what it needs to avoid, goes quiet, and what remains is a kind of attention so complete that the boundary between the observer and the observed begins to dissolve. This was not a metaphor for him. It was a description of a genuine change in the structure of experience. Under normal conditions, every act of perception is colored by interest. We look at a fruit tree and think about whether the fruit is ripe. We see a face and assess whether the person is a threat or a potential ally. The will filters everything through the question of what it can use. But in aesthetic contemplation, that filter drops away. The tree is no longer a source of food. The face is no longer a social calculation. They are simply there, apprehended in their full reality, and the person perceiving them has temporarily stepped outside the cycle of wanting altogether. Schopenhauer borrowed a concept from Plato to explain what the mind apprehends in these moments, though he gave it his own distinctive meaning. Plato had argued that behind every individual thing in the world, every particular horse, every particular act of justice, there existed an eternal, perfect form of which the individual was merely an imperfect copy. Schopenhauer adapted this idea and called these underlying patterns ideas, by which he meant something like the timeless archetypes that the will expresses when it takes on visible form. A great painting of a storm does not simply depict one particular storm on one particular day. It captures something about the idea of storm itself, the essential pattern of force and conflict that every individual storm merely approximates. The artist, in this view, is someone with an unusual capacity to perceive these ideas directly, to look past the surface clutter of individual objects and grasp the deeper forms they embody. This is what separates genuine art from mere technical skill or decoration. A technically accomplished painting of a bowl of fruit might impress the eye, but if it only reproduces the appearance of particular objects without revealing anything about the underlying pattern they express, it remains at the level of representation. The great artist sees through the particular to the universal, and the work of art, when it succeeds, allows the viewer to do the same. This is why Schopenhauer treated the experience of art as something far more significant than a pleasant diversion. It was, in his framework, one of the few genuine escapes from the tyranny of the will. Not a permanent escape, since no human being can sustain pure aesthetic contemplation indefinitely, but a real one for as long as it lasted. The person absorbed in a great work of art is, for those minutes or hours, no longer a creature of appetite. They have become, briefly, something closer to a mirror than a mouth, a consciousness that reflects reality without trying to consume it. He arranged the arts in a hierarchy based on how effectively each one could achieve this liberation, and the ranking followed a logic rooted in his metaphysics. Architecture sat near the bottom, not because it was unworthy, but because its aesthetic content was bound up with the physical properties of matter, gravity, resistance, the interplay of load and support. Sculpture and painting rose higher because they could capture the human form and the drama of human expression, bringing the viewer closer to the ideas that manifest in living creatures. Poetry and tragedy climbed higher still, because they dealt directly with the inner life, with the conflicts and sufferings that the will inflicts on conscious beings. A great tragedy, in Schopenhauer's view, does not merely entertain. It lays bare the fundamental structure of human existence, the way desire leads inevitably to catastrophe, and in doing so, it gives the audience a moment of piercing clarity about their own condition. But above all of these, at the very summit of his hierarchy, Schopenhauer placed music. And here, his argument took a turn that was genuinely original, one that would echo through the intellectual life of the century that followed. Every other art form works by representing something. A painting depicts a scene, a poem describes an emotion, a sculpture renders a body. Music, however, does not represent anything at all. It bypasses the entire world of representation and speaks, as it were, in the language of the will itself. What he meant by this was that music does not copy the surface appearances of the world the way a landscape painting copies a vista. Instead, it mirrors the inner movements of the will directly, the surging and receding, the tension and release, the restless striving and momentary resolution that constitute the deepest rhythm of all existence. When a melody rises through a sequence of unresolved harmonies and finally arrives at its resolution, we do not hear a description of longing and fulfillment. We hear longing and fulfillment themselves, translated into sound without passing through the intermediate stage of visual or verbal representation. This is why music can move us so powerfully, even when we cannot say what it is about. A symphony has no characters, no plot, no argument, and yet it can produce emotional responses of an intensity that no painting or poem can easily match. Schopenhauer's explanation was that music reaches us at a level beneath thought, beneath imagery, beneath language, at the level where the will itself operates. We respond to it not because we understand it, but because we are it, because the patterns of tension and release in a piece of music mirror the patterns of desire and satisfaction that constitute our innermost experience. He was careful to specify that he meant instrumental music in particular, music without words. The moment a composer adds a text, a lyric, a narrative, a dramatic scenario, the music is pulled back into the world of representation, yoked to specific meanings and particular images. Pure instrumental music, unencumbered by language, is free to express the movements of the will in their most abstract and universal form. A sung aria might move us because we understand the character's grief, but a slow passage in a string quartet can move us without our knowing why, and for Schopenhauer, this was precisely the point. The less music explains, the more directly it communicates. The implications of this theory reached far beyond the boundaries of philosophy. If music is a direct copy of the will, then it is not merely one art form among others. It is a kind of metaphysical revelation, a way of hearing the inner nature of reality that no amount of rational argument could replicate. A great composer, in Schopenhauer's framework, is not simply a skilled craftsman arranging pleasant sounds. They are something closer to an unconscious philosopher, someone who grasps the structure of the will not through concepts, but through tone and rhythm, and who communicates that understanding to listeners in a form that bypasses the intellect entirely. This elevation of music above the other arts, and above philosophy itself in certain respects, would prove to be one of Schopenhauer's most influential ideas. One young composer in particular encountered these passages and felt them with a shock of recognition that would reshape the history of Western music. But even apart from its influence, the argument illuminated something important about Schopenhauer's character as a thinker. Here was a man who had built one of the darkest philosophical systems in the European tradition, a system that declared all striving futile and all satisfaction illusory, and yet he insisted that in the presence of great music, the torment could be briefly, genuinely suspended. The prison remained, but it had windows, and through those windows came sounds that, for a few trembling minutes at a time, made the prisoner forget the walls entirely. For most of his career, Schopenhauer wrote in near total obscurity. His major work sold so poorly that unsold copies were pulped for wastepaper, and for decades he lectured to empty rooms, while the philosophers he despised filled auditoriums across Germany. Yet, in the final years of his life, something shifted. A collection of his essays found a wider audience, and slowly, then with gathering momentum, his ideas began to seep into the intellectual life of Europe in ways that would outlast nearly every system that had overshadowed his own. The most far-reaching of these influences concerned something Schopenhauer had placed at the very center of his philosophy, but that most thinkers before him had barely acknowledged. The conscious, reasoning mind, he argued, is not the master of human behavior, but its servant. When he described the will as a blind, impersonal force driving every creature forward, he was making a claim that went well beyond metaphysics. He was saying that the motives people give for their actions, the rational explanations, the moral justifications, the carefully reasoned plans, are largely surface phenomena, stories the intellect tells itself to make sense of impulses that originate somewhere far deeper and darker. This was a genuinely radical proposition in an era that still placed enormous faith in reason. The dominant philosophical tradition, running from the Enlightenment through Kant and onward, had treated the rational mind as the defining feature of human dignity, the faculty that lifted people above the animals and gave them access to moral and scientific truth. Schopenhauer did not deny that reason existed, or that it had its uses. But he insisted that it was fundamentally secondary, a tool the will had evolved to help it get what it wanted, not a sovereign power capable of overriding the will's demands. He noticed, with a psychologist's eye, that people routinely deceive themselves about why they do what they do. A man consumed by envy convinces himself that his hostility toward a more successful colleague is based on principled disagreement. A woman drawn to a lover she knows to be unsuitable constructs elaborate arguments for why the relationship is wise. Schopenhauer called this kind of self-deception a form of the will's cunning, the intellect recruited as a lawyer to defend desires it did not choose and cannot fully understand. He also observed that certain memories, certain desires, certain aspects of a person's inner life seem to resist being brought into conscious awareness. The mind, he suggested, actively works to keep painful truths about itself hidden, pushing them below the threshold of consciousness where they continue to operate without being examined. A person might feel a persistent anxiety without being able to name its source, or develop a sudden revulsion towards something that, if examined honestly, touches a wound they have spent years refusing to acknowledge. The will protects its own operations by keeping the intellect in the dark. Nearly half a century after these observations were set down, a young Viennese physician began developing a theory of the mind that would transform how the modern world understood human psychology. He proposed that beneath the surface of conscious thought lay a vast reservoir of repressed desires, fears, and memories, an unconscious that shaped behavior in ways the conscious self could neither see nor control. He argued that neurotic symptoms, dreams, and slips of the tongue were not random accidents, but meaningful expressions of conflicts buried below awareness. The parallels with Schopenhauer's philosophy were striking, and they were not coincidental. This physician, Freud, was familiar with Schopenhauer's work, though the precise degree of influence remains a subject of scholarly debate. Freud sometimes acknowledged the resemblance and sometimes played it down, claiming he had arrived at his conclusions independently through clinical observation. What is beyond dispute is that Schopenhauer had already sketched, in philosophical language, the basic architecture that psychoanalysis would later fill in with clinical detail. The idea that the conscious mind is not in charge, that it rationalizes rather than reasons, that painful truths are actively suppressed rather than simply forgotten, all of these were Schopenhauer's insights before they were Freud's. The philosopher had drawn the map. The physician would populate it with case studies. The concept that Freud would call repression, the mind's active effort to push threatening material out of awareness, was perhaps the most direct echo. Schopenhauer had described how the will could prevent certain thoughts from reaching consciousness, not through mere inattention, but through something closer to a motivated refusal. The mind did not simply fail to notice what was painful. It worked to keep painful knowledge at bay, and this effort could itself become a source of psychological disturbance. When Freud later described his patients' resistances, the strange reluctance they displayed when therapy approached the very memories that mattered most, he was documenting a process Schopenhauer had already named in the language of metaphysics. Schopenhauer's influence did not flow only into the sciences of the mind, however. It poured, with perhaps even greater force, into the arts. The composer who felt that shock of recognition upon reading Schopenhauer's elevation of music above all other forms of human expression was Richard Wagner, and the encounter changed the trajectory of his creative life. Wagner had already begun developing his vision of a new kind of dramatic music, but it was in Schopenhauer's philosophy that he found the theoretical justification for what he had been groping toward instinctively. What struck Wagner most deeply was the claim that music does not merely represent emotions or illustrate dramatic situations, but expresses the inner movements of the will itself. If this was true, then the orchestra was not a backdrop to the drama on stage. It was the drama's deepest voice, reaching beneath words and images to the primal forces driving the characters. Wagner absorbed this idea so thoroughly that it became the foundation of his mature style. His orchestral writing grew richer, denser, more psychologically layered, carrying an emotional narrative that often contradicted or complicated what the characters were saying aloud. A hero might declare his courage, while the orchestra murmured something darker and more ambivalent underneath, and this tension between surface and depth owed an enormous debt to Schopenhauer's vision. Wagner also embraced, with characteristic intensity, Schopenhauer's pessimism. The idea that all striving leads inevitably to suffering, that desire is a trap from which there is no clean escape, infused the dramatic world of his later operas with a gravity they might not otherwise have possessed. His characters do not fail because they make mistakes or because fate is arbitrary. They fail because the nature of wanting itself ensures that fulfillment is always temporary, and that the deepest longings of the heart lead, sooner or later, to destruction. The influence was so profound that Wagner later said he had read Schopenhauer's masterwork 4 times in a single year, each time with growing conviction that here, at last, was a thinker who had grasped what all his music had been trying to say. Yet the most consequential intellectual encounter with Schopenhauer's work was still to come, and it arrived through a young scholar barely out of his university years. This reader stumbled upon a copy of Schopenhauer's central work in a second-hand bookshop and was seized by it with an intensity he later described as almost physical. He carried it home and read it in a fever of concentration, barely sleeping, overwhelmed by the feeling that someone had finally articulated the dark undercurrent he had always sensed beneath the optimistic surface of modern life. This young reader was Friedrich Nietzsche, and though he would eventually turn against Schopenhauer's conclusions with fierce energy, the encounter permanently shaped the direction of his thought. Nietzsche accepted the premise that the world is driven by irrational, pre-rational forces, that reason is the will's servant rather than its master, that the comfortable narratives of progress and divine order are illusions that crumble under honest examination. What he rejected was the prescription. Where Schopenhauer counseled resignation and the quieting of the will, Nietzsche would come to argue for a radical affirmation of life, precisely because it is terrible, a defiant embrace of existence in all its cruelty and beauty. But that rebellion was itself only possible because Schopenhauer had cleared the ground. Before Nietzsche could declare war on pessimism, someone had to make pessimism philosophically serious, and that was Schopenhauer's achievement. He forced Western philosophy to confront the possibility that the deepest truths about human existence might not be reassuring ones, that a clear-eyed look at the structure of desire and consciousness might reveal something closer to a trap than a gift. Nietzsche would build his own philosophy on the rubble of that confrontation, transforming Schopenhauer's despairing honesty into a strange and ferocious hope. But the honesty came first, and it came from the lonely old man who had spent decades writing for an audience that barely existed. There is a peculiar contradiction in the fact that one of the darkest philosophies ever constructed has offered genuine comfort to so many of its readers. Schopenhauer told the world that desire is a trap, that satisfaction is an illusion, and that the fundamental engine driving all life is a blind, purposeless force that cares nothing for the happiness of the creatures it animates. By any reasonable measure, this should be a repellent message, the kind of conclusion a person encounters once and sets aside in favor of something warmer. And yet, generation after generation, people have come to his work in moments of genuine distress and walked away feeling not worse, but strangely, unmistakably better. The reason has little to do with the grim satisfaction some people take in having their worst suspicions confirmed. It runs deeper than that. What Schopenhauer offered was something the modern world has always been reluctant to provide, a philosophical framework in which suffering is not a failure, not a punishment, not a problem to be solved, but the fundamental condition of conscious existence. To a person crushed by the sense that their unhappiness means something is wrong with them, this reframing can arrive with the force of an absolution. Consider the unspoken assumptions that shape most people's inner lives. From childhood onward, the prevailing cultural message is that happiness is the natural state of a well-managed life, that the right combination of effort, insight, and good choices should produce a more or less contented existence. When contentment fails to materialize, or when it arrives and evaporates faster than expected, the individual is left with an uncomfortable conclusion. Either they have made some mistake, or there is something fundamentally defective about who they are. The weight of this conclusion is enormous and almost entirely invisible, because the assumption it rests on is so deeply woven into the texture of modern life that most people never think to question it. Schopenhauer questioned it with systematic thoroughness. He argued that the failure of desire to produce lasting happiness is not a flaw in any particular person's character or circumstances. It is a structural feature of consciousness itself, built into the architecture of the will, as inescapable as gravity. The pendulum between pain and boredom does not swing because one has chosen the wrong career, married the wrong person, or failed to cultivate the right attitude. It swings because that is what pendulums do. And there is a strange but genuine relief in hearing someone say, with philosophical precision and unflinching clarity, that the game was rigged from the beginning. This is not the same as despair, though it can look like despair from the outside. There is a crucial difference between believing that happiness is possible and that you have simply failed to reach it, and believing that the kind of permanent, settled happiness the culture promises was never available to anyone. The first belief produces shame and frantic effort. The second, paradoxically, can produce something closer to peace. If the endless wanting is not a personal deficiency, but a universal condition, then the individual is released from the exhausting task of trying to fix what was never broken, or rather, what was always broken, in everyone, by design. Schopenhauer understood this dynamic intuitively, even if he did not always articulate it in therapeutic terms. His philosophy functions, for many readers, as a kind of permission to stop pretending that life is something other than what it plainly appears to be. In a culture saturated with injunctions to think positively, to manifest outcomes, to treat every setback as a hidden opportunity, the sheer honesty of his pessimism can feel like stepping out of a crowded, overlit room into cool air. Nothing has changed about the world, but something has changed about the pressure to feel a certain way about it. There is also a subtler form of comfort embedded in his treatment of compassion. If the boundaries between individuals are, at the deepest level, illusory, if the same blind will thrashes through every living creature, then suffering is not something that isolates a person, but something that connects them to everything alive. The loneliness that often accompanies pain, the sense that no one else could possibly understand, dissolves in a philosophy where the pain of a stranger and the pain of the self are ultimately expressions of the same underlying force. Schopenhauer did not sentimentalize this connection or dress it in the language of universal brotherhood. But, by arguing that compassion arises precisely from the recognition that another's suffering is not fundamentally different from one's own, he gave loneliness a philosophical answer that reaches beneath the usual platitudes. It is worth pausing over the fact that this comfort does not depend on any promise of improvement. Most philosophies and religions that deal with suffering offer some form of redemption, a better world to come, a lesson being learned, a self being strengthened through adversity. Schopenhauer offered nothing of the kind. There is no redemptive arc in his system, no hidden purpose that suffering serves, no guarantee that the pain will prove to have been worth enduring. And yet, the comfort remains. It remains because, for many people, the most oppressive aspect of suffering is not the suffering itself, but the demand that it mean something, that it be transformed into a narrative of growth. When that demand is removed, and suffering is simply acknowledged as the texture of existence, rather than a stage in a journey towards something better, the sufferer is free to stop performing the exhausting labor of finding the silver lining, and can instead simply sit with what is. This is why Schopenhauer has endured in ways that the optimistic systems of his contemporaries have not. The grand philosophies of progress that dominated the 19th century, the sweeping visions of history marching toward reason and freedom, have largely collapsed under the weight of the centuries that followed them. The wars, the engineered famines, the industrialized cruelties of the 20th century made it difficult to maintain, with a straight face, that history was a story of inevitable improvement. Schopenhauer's philosophy required no such faith. It had already accounted for the worst that human beings could do to one another, because it had never pretended that the force driving human behavior was anything other than blind and indifferent. But to leave the story here, with a thinker who simply diagnosed darkness and was vindicated by history, would be to miss something essential about what makes his work lastingly valuable. Schopenhauer did not merely describe a prison. He described the windows in it. The moments of aesthetic absorption, when the self falls quiet and the world is perceived without the distortion of desire. The moments of genuine compassion, when the barrier between self and other thins to nothing. Even the moments of philosophical understanding itself, when the mind turns its attention to the structure of its own captivity and, in the very act of comprehending the trap, achieves a flicker of freedom from it. These were never presented as permanent escapes. The will always reasserts itself, the wanting always returns, and the pendulum resumes its arc. But the fact that such moments exist at all, that a creature built entirely for striving can, however briefly, stop striving and simply see, was for Schopenhauer not a minor consolation, but a genuine wonder. He lived the last years of his life in a quiet that earlier decades had denied him. Readers finally came, recognition finally arrived, and he received both with the wary satisfaction of a man who had waited too long to be entirely grateful. He kept his habits until the end, his daily walks, his flute playing, his poodle trotting beside him through the streets of Frankfurt. He did not soften his views, discover late-life optimism, or recant his bleaker conclusions. He simply lived as a man who had looked at the worst truth he could find and had not been destroyed by it. What remains, long after the details of his system have been absorbed or challenged or overtaken by later thinkers, is something more like an attitude than an argument. It is the insistence that honesty about the human condition is not the enemy of a livable life, but its unlikely ally. That the courage to look at suffering without flinching, without explaining it away, without demanding that it justify itself, can produce a calm that no amount of forced cheerfulness ever could. And that in a world ceaselessly urging its inhabitants to want more and achieve more, the quiet voice that says, "This was always how it was, and you were never failing," carries a peculiar and lasting power. Most of us have been told, in one way or another, that our unhappiness is a problem we need to solve. When you hear instead that it was never yours to fix, does that feel like freedom, or does it feel like surrender? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for watching.